Hi everyone, I'm going to start right now because apparently I only have 15 minutes and I thought I had 30, so I'm going to kind of go through things kind of quickly. So I'm going to start my conference. Wait, this isn't true. I thought I had 30, right? I have 30 minutes, so I'm not going to rush it as much as I was going to. Thanks. Okay, so I'm going to start this with a confession. Not really how I typically start my conference talks, but just so we're all on the same page here. I used to work with another programming language that you may have heard of, called PHP. Anyone else a PHP developer here? Ex-PHP developer? Yes, I'm not alone. This is great. So I really liked PHP. I really liked it. I did a lot of conference talks on it, and I liked it so much that I bought a motorcycle and a license plate in England with PHP on the back. This isn't Photoshop. This is a real bike. And I got people, I said, I didn't like JavaScript developers at the time. They're great now, but back then I didn't. And I said, watch out, JavaScript developers. And I got people telling me, please don't crash this bike for the sake of the PHP community, because the JavaScript guys will never let us hear the end of it. And then obviously 6 months later, here's me having had a motorcycle accident. That was rather painful. But now I'm a Go person. I really like Go. So naturally, I had to kind of do the same sort of thing here. So I now have Go on my license plate, and also 418, which is HTTP 418. I'm a teapot, if anyone knows that HTTP code. And the interesting thing is, I haven't crashed it yet. I don't know if that's anything to do with Go being better than PHP in crashing and things, because PHP crashes all the time. But yeah. So why am I doing this conference talk? Well, why am I talking about dependency injection in Go? Well, whenever I pick up a new language, there's always kind of a set of things that I go through in order to say, okay, I know now enough to be able to build something cool. And typically, I say things like, how do I communicate over TCP? With Go, initially, I learned how to do it with HTTP, and then with RPC, with gRPC and protobuf. And there were many other questions. Usually, the reason I put this here is because a lot of people on Twitter always say things like, I want to learn Go, please give me a book or a resource, and it's not my first language. And I'm saying, dude, if it's not your first language, just build something you've already built in another bloody language, and then you learn how you do it in this way rather than the previous way. So you've already got the use case that you need. And the big question that I always ask, and I did this in PHP, I did this in Swift, and now I've done this in Go, is how do I fully automate dependency injection for rapid application development, if possible? So this is the talk of my story of how the things I figured out, what I ended up building, how it didn't really work out for the reasons I will show you, and then maybe a better solution, which is using something from Google. But it's still not quite what I want it to be. So you will see how I progress in this story. So I'm going to show you my journey, implementing runtime dependency injection atrociously. I'm going to give a live demo above because actually I now have enough time to do this live demo, so that's great. I'm then going to move on to compile time dependency injection and the benefits, and discuss the pros and cons of each, and some of the problems that I encountered and solved along the way. And then what I'd learned from this and what I'd love to see next. And actually, there's a question that you will see that comes up, and I've asked this each time. I haven't done this talk at a full conference before, but I've done it at a few user groups, and I always ask the same question towards the end. And if anyone can solve this question for me, that would be amazing. But I haven't met anyone who's willing to divulge their information yet, because it will unleash evil on the Go community potentially. So let's see. So dependency injection, first and foremost, is a really, really posh word, probably a gatekeeping word, actually, if you think about it, for something extremely simple. You have a repository here, the new factory method, which is kind of the standard in Go, and it's taking a type DB to inject it into it, which is basically passing arguments. There's nothing complex here. And this is how you'd do it in main. You would initialize the DB first, and then you would pass it into the repository initializer. That's basically it. So how can this be automated? That was the first thing. So what I wanted to do was, using this example here as the first thing I came up with, I wanted to be able to say, okay, I'm going to have some sort of injector, and I'm going to say, make me a repository, and do everything that you need to do to get me that repository, including all of its dependencies, including all of these other things. So my goal was to be able to tell, and this is why I said in any language, this is probably any language, I will try and do the same thing, because the general process of this sort of thing would be to tell some library to build the repository. It would use reflection to see the dependencies. It would find the DB as a dependency, and then it would use reflection on that, so it's recursive, which I'm terrible at recursion in the code, which if you ever look on GitHub to see this, is atrocious. I then initialize the DB dependency, initialize the repository with the DB dependency that I just created, and then ideally that would all happen with 0 configuration. So throughout this whole object graph, this whole hierarchy, I could say, give me this object or this struct, and it will have all of its dependencies injected as a result. So with Go, and because of the dynamics of interface, one of the downsides is that what I would get back would be a type interface. It's anything. We don't have generics yet in Go. Then you have to type assert it, which is one of the downsides. But here's an example of using reflection. Can you see that up there, or is that that fan thing in the way? It's just a repository with a DB struct. Everyone see this okay? Okay. I see nods. And then look at this code here that very simple, you can create yourself. It has this function called build fields, and you pass it something. So I'm passing it the repository type. And then what I'm doing is I'm looping through all of the fields on this struct. And I'm going to avoid saying objects because we're not talking object-oriented programming here. I'll probably get evil looks if I say that word. So I'm using the reflect package, and I'm looking at the internals of this thing I've given it, which is the repository. I find DB as a dependency. Then I dynamically initialize this new instance of this dependency. And then I set that on the original struct, iterate, go over and over and over, and then finally you get back the, obviously this will be recursive, and then finally you get back the actual repository, which you then have to type assert, and make sure it's of the correct type. So at a very high level, we're just looping around all of the fields of this struct, initializing them, injecting them, using this reflect.new, albeit recursively, and until you don't find any properties in the chain, and then you inject them one by one. Nothing too crazy. Well, I mean, it's crazy, but it's nothing too complex. So my goal first was, how can I create a struct from a string? So much Googling, so much Stack Overflowing. Never found the answer to this apart from with a type registry or a map. That's what I ended up going with. This is like my golden question. I'm sure there's a way of doing it with unsafe. I'm not supposed to do that, but this is one of the things I found before Go version 1.13. I think it was Go 1.8. I can't remember, but some genius on Stack Overflow found that if you have this assembly here, which I don't understand, and then this type that you create in your code base, then given this code here, you can get the type of a struct without actually having the type in the code. And I really wanted this to work, and I was really, really sad that it didn't. If you want to look at the question here and the answer, it's quite interesting. Unfortunately, this doesn't work with newer versions of Go. So I resigned myself to what everyone's saying. Instead of a big switch, I have a registry of types. Now, this is an example of a registry of types. It's literally a map string to something, some struct or interface or whatever. And I'm saying the repository is this, the DB is this. So this is the first thing I came up with after not being able to solve the previous problem. And my idea was, how can I automate the generation of this? To make it as quick as possible. So remember, my goal was automatic dependency injection here. How would I automate the generation of that thing up there? So I figured out the AST package itself. Does anyone use the AST package here for static analysis and things like that? It's pretty cool. For the people who don't know it, it allows you to go into the types and everything you have in your code itself programmatically and see what there is and do things based on the information you find on how you've structured your code. What I was doing was I was looping through all of the files in a directory, all of the Go files. And don't worry too much about this huge wall of code. It's not here for anything important. But the most important thing is I found structs using the AST. Yes, that's the first step. I found structs and I appended them to an array of structs. I'm doing a lot of things here. There's a such thing as a type spec. Is it a type struct, or is it an interface, or is it other things? You can find out that it's a struct. I add it to an array called struct. And then finally, at the end, once I have this array of structs, once I've run through the AST, through all the Go files that I have, I wrote it to a file. So I write this map string interface to a file, which I call registry.go. And I didn't end up using the template package because I couldn't be bothered to figure out how to make it work. But I basically had this text here. And then in between funcdef and funcbottom, that's where I would put all of my the structs that I have found using the AST. So the end result was that it basically generated a file like this, which is exactly what I wanted. So the first problem that I had with this is that what happens if you have two keys of the same? Anyone know what happens if you have two keys the same in a map? Well, it's exactly, it didn't work very well. So that failed when you have two structs somewhere, anywhere in the application, which is quite common, that have the same name. So this didn't work very well, and with the AST, for some reason, I couldn't get I don't know what the full name of the proper name of it is, but I couldn't get the fully qualified name of a struct, a fully qualified path, if you will. So even though we're not doing auto-loading or this crazy stuff from PHP world, I wanted to be able to say that this struct resides in this package, and say it's in internal package, it would be the name of your app / internal dot, and then the name of the struct. So, for example, here's an example of two repositories in two directories, and this is what would cause the problem. So let me show you what I did to solve this, and you can judge me later. This actually caused my application that was building this file to be very slow. But I executed go list for every single file, and as a result, that actually gave me the full path of this file. So I wasn't doing this with Go routines or anything. I was executing go list, which ended up giving me basically this app /dir1 dot repository, app /dir2 repository. And I also did some aliasing at the top as well, so there would be no collisions. So this leads me to recursively initializing a struct and attempting recursive dependency injection using this type registry. So I created this injector, and I added this method called make, which basically does the reflection thing that you've seen before. It looks up structs in this type registry, initializes the struct depending on the string you've given it, and then does everything recursively. So look for the name, reflect on the struct, look at the dependencies. For each dependency, look in the registry if it's there, and finally inject each one by one. Now this was a prototype. I didn't include any error handling in this, so I would just panic as soon as I didn't find something. So this is one of the first problems with runtime dependency injection, especially my implementation. It can fail during the application itself running. But anyway, we'll come to that later. So I needed to make this work with the factory methods. So the new repository, for example, it would have to know that there is a new for this type, and then use that to initialize the type, especially when you've got private properties here, like this DB, this private field. It's not exported. You have to call new repository. That's the only way to initialize it properly. So given this convention, again, this is a big bulk of code. You don't need to worry too much about it. I've removed all of the important things in there. But I'm basically looking for something that has new in the name of the function using the AST, getting the type that it's returning, and then once I found this, adding this to an array now called factories. So I've got an array of structs, I've got an array of factories, and back to the map here, now I say that this factory creates this type. I wish I could do this at runtime somehow. I haven't figured it out yet. I also was using the AST and couldn't create a type from the AST type because they're two separate things. I couldn't figure out how to do that yet either. But now I have structs and repositories. So make now automatically invokes this new repository when it's asked for a repository, and new DB when it's asked for a DB. But this isn't useful yet in any sort of application context. And the reason for that is there's one key component missing, and that is to be able to build something in your composition root, which is typically where you start all your wiring and building it together, telling each other this depends on this. and then have it injected further down the line somewhere, that one you have initialized in main. For example, the database connection. You would initialize that in main, and then share that, and have it somewhere further down the line injected. So I came up with this concept of share next, which is, well, imagine you have these database credentials stored here. And this is an example, this get-env. I've put them in the env for now. You could probably get them from some configuration service or something, but I have them in the env. I create a DB in main, and then I tell the inject to share. Here, take this instance, this thing I've created, and then when I make my service, somewhere down that hierarchy of making it, if you require a database, take the one that I've already initialized in the composition root and inject that one instead. So what does that mean? It means now that if I have this type registry automatically created, which I don't, I still have to run a command, then I can go somewhere in the code base and say, actually, okay, I need a dependency here. I need a DB. I'm going to put DB in the struct, and boom, I will have the DB injected for me. That was my goal. So this is what I call rapid application development now, because I can just not care too much about how things are wired together, as long as it's not terribly atrocious in performance, which it was. But I can, and you'll see why, but basically I can build things and get them running quickly. So then I had another problem. What about if there were two factory methods for a single struct? Maybe you have this new service 1, new service 2, and they each have different values. How do I tell the injector which one to choose? Again, I would have to have another method now, which was called delegate, which would say when you encounter this and it has two factories, use one of them that I've specified at the beginning. And this started getting outrageously out of control code-wise. Here's an example of how it working with lambdas over here too. You give it a function that returns a service, and then it uses that instead. But this code was starting to get really confusing, and especially when I came up with interfaces. How would I work with interfaces? The final problem was, what if the injector encountered a DB interface? How would it know which concrete implementation of that interface would it use? And also, my mindset was using explicit interfaces here. I wasn't even thinking about implicit interfaces. This is a completely separate concern. So for now, when I say interfaces in this context, make sure you're thinking of not necessarily the right way of doing it, which is explicit interfaces. In fact, at work, actually, we're removing all of our explicit interfaces from the code base because we found that we don't need them. Using the implicit interfaces defined next to the consumer is actually really easy to do, and that's what we're doing. But for now, focus on the explicit interfaces, because this is all I was focusing on when I built this. So I would need to be able to tell the injector, when you encounter a DB, which is an interface, actually inject the MongoDB concrete implementation. And that's bind, which I came up with here. So back to the AST parser. So now I have structs from the AST, I have factories from the AST, and now I need interfaces from the AST. And this was actually really easy. You just need to look at the type, AST interface type, and then you have all of the interfaces that you need. So I could create this file here saying, here's the interface, and here's all the concrete implementations of that interface. There's actually a tool that I found out later, which I'd probably use to do this. It's called GoGuru. Has anyone heard of GoGuru here? There's some really powerful stuff in that. I think even IDEs use GoGuru to do some of the stuff. It's a tool that's actually designed for IDEs, I think. Imagine a UI. You're building this UI where you could select some code and say, show implements. And then it would show you all of the implements. This is what GoGuru does. I'm guessing it uses the AST under the hood. I'm not quite sure. But this is what your IDE, my favorite IDE, might be calling out to find the implements. And I'd probably use this for next time for the type registry, but I didn't last time. But you can check out this thing if you're interested. So my interface so far was make, delegate, bind, and share. So it handled factories, it handled interfaces. And I actually stopped here because things got super complicated. Debugging was an absolute nightmare. I was writing a line to the log file every time something was recursed or initialized. So you are now looking at the service. The service now requires a DB field. The DB field has type this. It's actually a pointer, so we're not going to inject the struct. We're going to create a pointer from it, and all the really hacky stuff. So it took me several weeks of fixing random things, and it still doesn't work fully. This is a while back now, but I'm going to give you a quick demo of where I got up to. I'm going to create an MVC language-agnostic pattern framework foundation for auto-wiring in a few minutes, maybe not two. I'm going to configure the database in the composition root and have that auto-injected further down the line somewhere in the object hierarchy or the struct hierarchy, ignore object. And then I'm going to interface the database and show you how you can switch between the two. And then I will look at the cons of this and move on to compile time dependency injection with Google Wire. So normally when you do a talk and you're doing a live demo, you should record this just in case. But I'm going to dice with the devil now and see if it actually works. I'll share my display. Okay, good. So here's the first thing that I have. I have a file. Does everyone see that, or do I need to zoom in? Is that okay? If you need to zoom in, just raise your hand, and I'll do it. So I'm saying here that when I encounter the root /, I want to initialize an index controller, and then I want to invoke the invoke method, and the same with the test controller and the test method. So the very first thing I'm going to do, actually, is I'm going to create these. Remove that ring. I'm going to call it internal. That's what I've always done it in my examples. Let's just say controller. And then in there, I'm going to create index. Inde. So I have a struct of type index controller and a function on it called invoke, I think was the name. And this will have to take a HTTP response writer. And then I can probably say w.write takes an array of bytes. Hello from index. And just because I'm a perfectionist, there we go. Okay, so I've not so much of a perfectionist to change index to index though. So now in my main, the only code I have here is some roots, a router, and this listen and serve. The roots is taking the YAML from the YAML file, and then because YAML is clearly the best thing ever in the world for these sorts of things, and then initializing this struct of roots, which has the root, the controller, and the action as strings. Nothing special here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to loop through these and then register them as being able to be handled for the web server. That's not anything dynamic, really. You can do this yourself anyway. Looping around the roots, I'm going to do this, which I forgot once, and I couldn't figure out how to make it work. I have to do that. It's a go gotcha. Does anyone know why I have to do this in this loop? I'm still not, I understand what I have to do. I still don't get why I have to do it, but I have to create a copy so it always uses that one instead of the last one in the array. But then I'm going to say to the router, handle for this path, which is the root, this here. So let's just do let's just make sure this works, right? So I can serve it. Hello from main. Is this going to work? Let's see. Hello from main. So this is just basic web server, nothing special. But now, given the fact that I'm going to /, I want to initialize the index controller with the injector, and then call the invoke method on it. So first, I need to create this type registry using this horrible command. So there we go. I now have this registry over here. Everyone see generally this okay? It's okay? So the thing you need to see is I have this key here, basically, index controller, and then the actual type, which is the index controller. So now with that, I can initialize this using an injector. So I have to pass it that type registry. Get to registry. Not going to log anything. I'll show you the logging later if I have time. It's atrocious. And then with the injector, I'm going to say ij.make rt.controller. And I'm going to log that so you can see what it is. Do I have that? Writer.write. Reflect.type of. So now you're going to see what it's actually initialized when I do this. and it crashed. And this is a perfect example of why. I'm on /test, aren't I? There you go. That's the actual type that it's initialized. Nothing particularly complicated here. I'm going to call that the controller. And then I have a method called invoke, which allows me to call a method on that. And you can do that with reflection. It's nothing hacky like the initialization of a struct. You don't need any type registry. I think it's called call. I think it's just call, and you pass whatever arguments you need to. So on the controller, the action, and I'm also going to give it the response writer. So now let's see if this works. Unexpected bloody bracket. Hello from index. So it's dynamically initialized and gone through to this thing. And you saw a perfect example of what would happen if I haven't handled errors properly. It would crash. It would just crash. That's one of the downsides of this. So I don't have time to create a second one, but what I am going to do is I'm going to create a DB now. Not actual DB, just a struct with it in. Type DB struct, and it takes a connection string. Let's leave it at that. And what I want to do now in my composition root is to initialize this with something from, say, the environment. So db connection string equals os.getEnv con, let's say con, and I'm going to pass this in with the command line. Then I'm going to say the db is db.db. So now I'm going to initialize this database, and then I'm going to say share it. So whenever something further down the line asks for this, it's going to inject that DB that I've initialized here. So let's just go back into our index controller, and say that's now a dependency. Hello from index, and the connection string is the controller .db.connection string. Okay, so I'm getting a red in this file. Is it complaining about the index? Anyone see what's red in here, or is it just, it's probably a typo or something, right? No, it's the right one. It's not red anymore. It's not. It's fine now. It's stupid IDE. Okay, so now I'm not going to run this again. I need to generate that file again. And I show you this registry now. It now has this. Well, it doesn't have it actually. It's what? Sorry. It's true. You're right. Absolutely right. I created it in the wrong place. Thank you very much. You saved my presentation. Okay, so now the index controller is here and the interface is here. So now, if I run this, you should see that it prints no connection string. But if I put con equals 1, 2, 3, 4, and not do something with Vigo, which has nothing to do with this presentation, then it's passed through. I initialized it, and then it's injected somewhere further down the line. So this is where I got up to. And I found a lot of problems with this. I was trying to convince some guys at work that this is really cool, that we should use this in production, and yeah, they actually considered it for a little bit, and I'm glad to say that we didn't go ahead with it, because even though I thought it had a very simple to use API and it was fast for application development when things are working, and it was mostly automatic registration of everything. With new properties or auto-injected, the problems are I wrote it for a start. You have to type assert everything you get out of it because it's an interface and we don't have generics yet. And I still needed to generate this registry every single time. It was difficult to find something that was going wrong, just like this gentleman over here figured out that it was in the wrong package. Thank you very much. It doesn't even work properly in normal cases because I didn't finish it. This is the problem. I figured if someone shares a DB at the beginning and they ask for a pointer to that, and then something's happening in the Go routine somewhere else, how the hell am I going to do all this kind of making thread safety and stuff like this. How am I going to make sure that things are safe? And I didn't want to have to go into mutexes and all these things just for the little experiment. So I basically copied everything. And I'm actually leaning more towards copies now, as very much against them. Because from what I've understood, and some really good blog posts on this by people way more knowledgeable than I am about how actually if you're copying a struct, you have no garbage collection to worry about. It's actually faster in many cases, maybe just in these big loops that they're doing. But with pointers, I didn't want to care too much about that. So if somebody was asking for a pointer, I was still making a copy of it and then referencing that. That's how I was doing it when everyone asked for a pointer. And it requires a registry of all the types in memory now. I ran through, if you have 1,000 types and all of these, they don't take too much memory, but still it's not very, very good. And debugging was an absolute nightmare. And I wanted to show you what the debugging was like. I need to press next, the right button on this ring. This is what the debugging looked like. It's the only thing I could do. I was so crazy at this point that I was even considering graphically creating like a box here that said the controller, and then a line somehow, and then another box, and then drawing this graph in the terminal. But thankfully, I found other ways. So moving on to compile time in dependency injection. So we have the same problem as we had before, but this time using Google Wire, what I would do is I have to write this function here called initialize repository, and you tell Wire which factories it has to call in order to initialize this repository. And then when you say wire, it will generate this file, and this file is then completely separate from what it's how it built it, completely separate, and you can use that however you want. You can get rid of wire, never use it again. It just generates your factories for you. That's what it does. So given the fact that you now have two concretes implementing an interface, for example, with wire, this is the sort of code over here on the right that you would have to write to be able to say, if I encounter a DB, inject the Postgres DB. This connection string up here was a bit crazy because this wasn't used anywhere in this code here. It's not used anywhere when you're writing this. So your IDE is flashing you orange saying you haven't used this connection string, but actually Wire has when it's generated that file at the end. And this is what it generates. And if you have two strings, then you have to type alias it to, say, connection string over there. And this was kind of annoying. So the pros and cons of this, and I didn't want to do too much on that because you can Google that and figure it out yourself. It's a very simple tutorial. The pro of this is I didn't write it. It provides the compile time guarantees that you need, so you will know before you run the application likely if something's going to fuck up. It's much more of a standardized solution. There's no coupling to the library after the generation of those files. You can throw wire away and never use it again after you've generated these things. You have no terrible debugging. And the thing is, at the time, I was using my IDE, Goland, and you couldn't actually, at that point, look in the reflect value. So you had to, I had to do basically the equivalent of var dump-driven debugging. I was just print lining everything, and it took a long time to do. In my opinion, it doesn't have as friendly an API. It's not fully automatic. Far fewer features than typical IDE libraries. I have to wrap up now quickly, but basically my thoughts on runtime versus compile time are this. Runtime can't provide the type guarantees. I didn't have any unit tests proving all this worked. Until a runtime tool works 100% and is community-backed, which probably doesn't exist yet, compile time would be better. And use runtime in your side projects if you like. I actually found out that something already existed like mine, but it just didn't have the auto-generation of those of the things from the AST, and that was, I think it was Facebook's Facebook Inject, but that's actually archived now, so clearly they weren't too happy with this sort of thing. So what am I going to do next? Where am I going to go with this? Because I haven't finished being interested in this, and I'm thinking about building a tool that automates the automation of building the tool for, you know what I mean, right? So I'm going to try and automate Google Wire creation. That's the only thing I can think of right now, because I still want those compile time guarantees where possible. And I'm still going to work on this side project for fun. So you can see where I give up in the recursion on this and literally copy a chunk of code. If you were to go into GitHub, you will see a copy and paste somewhere. That's it. Thank you. Anyone want to ask any questions without insulting me for what I did?
After like this whole journey, right now because like I agree, dependency injection is something that I see a lot when people are migrating to Go. They're like, how do I inject my dependencies? And usually there's a lot of people really used to use dependency injection libraries, but they don't understand the concept to build it manually. Not the dependency injection system, but just inject manually. Do you always use the dependency injection library right now, or if it's small, you do it manually? Because I've faced this problem, and right now my answer is like, you probably don't need dependency injector. You can just do libraries, right? You can just do manually.
Yeah, you can just do it yourself, yeah. Yeah, the thing is, at work, for example, we, in one of our projects that's starting to get quite big, we had a lot of things going on in main, and someone tried to abstract that out into something called a DI container, but it was basically a service locator. It contained all of the dependencies, and it was also a singleton, so you would ask it for something, and then you would get it out, and it would store it, so you didn't have to ask for it again. If there was an fully automated solution that was quick to get working with a simple API, it's typically the first thing I do in any language, no matter the size of the project, because then it's a tool there to help you rapidly develop things. When it comes to your first thing that you said, which was the fact that people come into these frameworks and things and they have a clue what they're doing and then they take bad practices elsewhere. I've seen this in the PHP community as well. There's this framework called Laravel, which is based on a lot of bad practices, and all these newbies are joining it and learning these terrible things and then going to conferences and saying, hey, we should do this, and then getting shot down by people that actually use real frameworks. So I think it can be dangerous, but I always encourage anyone that actually wants to progress anywhere that they have to try and build their own framework and build their own thing like this the first time themselves to figure out how it works and what fails about it, the downsides of it, and then take it into consideration. It's a downside of any technology using an ORM. You don't know how to write the SQL queries anymore. You're just using an ORM. I bloody don't know how to write the SQL queries anymore. I've used an ORM for so long. Even in Go, that was another one of the first questions I came up with. How can I automate my SQL queries? And I used Go ORM, and then we found that it was doing 119 queries for one thing that should have been one entity from the database. So I'm looking forward to getting rid of that soon. But yeah, I'm going on a rant now. But yeah, there's always downsides to these things. You just have to make sure that the tool is used by not stupid people or people that are willing to learn. Any other questions that aren't insults? Okay, if anyone wants to talk to me afterwards, if anyone has a solution to that thing that I really want to find out, please, I'm begging you, tell me, and then I can do more evil things. Thank you very much.